Lord, we don't need another mountain. There are mountains and hillsides enough to climb. There are oceans and rivers enough to cross,
enough to last till the end of time.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Atlantic, Pacific and Beyond. My name is Karen Meenan and I'm delighted to be back with you in Near FM. Atlantic, Pacific and Beyond is a brand new series sharing knowledge and experience about global equity, a follow-on to the very popular series about brain health, Voyager Around My Brain, and talking about neurodegeneration. We'll be joined again by LLARC in the UK. LLARC is also known as LARC. It's the Later Life Audio and Radio Cooperative, a network of older content creators, age-inclusive radio stations, third sector organisations and researchers working on ageing issues. They'll all be available on the Near FM website, near.ie, so you can listen again to this series. And indeed, you can catch up on the previous episodes of Voyager Around My Brain and talking about neurodegeneration on the Listen Back service. The Atlantic Institute is a global community of fellows who tackle the persistent inequities across the globe through collective action and leadership. The fellows are courageous, compassionate and collaborative thinkers and doers who collectively seek to bring lasting improvements to their communities and to the world. These fellows are based in 5 continents and share a passion for global brain health, social equity, race equity and economic equity. Atlantic, Pacific and Beyond is a new series exploring global equity with special guests from the Atlantic Institute and beyond who'll share their favourite music, poetry and stories about their work. Joining me in our virtual studio this evening are 3 very special guests who'll discuss what global equity means to them. Our first song, What the World Needs Now, was by Burt Bacharach, and to keep things global, I'm going to play our next piece of music chosen by our first guest, Professor Cindy Weinstein, who'll be joining us all the way from California. Cindy's music choice this evening is What a Wonderful World by Louis Armstrong.
I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them bloom for me and you, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. I see skies of blue and clouds of white, the bright blessed day, the dark sacred night, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. The colors of the rainbow, so pretty in the sky, are also on the faces of people going by. I see friends shaking hands, saying, how do you do? They're really saying, I love you. I hear babies cry, I watch them grow. They'll learn much more than I'll ever know. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Yes, I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
That was What a Wonderful World from the album of the same name, which was released in 1968. And it was the music choice of our first guest, Professor Cindy Weinstein. Hi Cindy, you're very welcome to Near FM and LLRC this evening. How are you?
I'm good, Karen. Thank you.
Gorgeous choice. Why did you choose that song?
It's from 1968. It's a remnant of my childhood. My father, about whom I wrote a book, loved Louis Armstrong. So it's in honor of him. I think we need to keep that song in mind, given everything that's going on in the world right now, the possibility, the potential of the world to be more wonderful than it currently is. One of the things that I found so powerful about my experience as a fellow in the Global Brain Health Institute was how it brought the world together. And I had an opportunity to talk with and interact with people from all over the globe, everywhere from Botswana to South Africa to Oregon to Washington, D.C. to Jamaica. And it was a encapsulation of the world and the possibilities that come along with bringing people together to make the world a better place.
Wow, beautifully said, Cindy. Thank you so much. And just to give our listeners a little more background about you, you are the Eli and Edith Broad Professor of American Literature at the California Institute of Technology. Your expertise is in the 19th century. You've written 3 monographs and have edited 4 volumes. Additionally, you teach courses in women's fiction, Black literature, Herman Melville and Edgar Allan Poe. Earlier this year, you published Finding the Right Words, a story of literature, grief and the brain with Dr. Bruce Miller. This book illustrates the emotional challenges of loving someone with dementia and provides caregivers with an explanation of the neurological complexities of dementia. You've described the writing of this book as being the primary achievement of your life. Maybe, Cindy, would you tell our listeners a little bit more about that?
This was a book of a very long time in the making. My father was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's in his mid-50s when I was a graduate student at Berkeley. And his initial symptom was not knowing language, not getting words. Since then, I've learned that this is called the logopenic variant. Dr. Bruce Miller gave me that diagnosis. When my father was sick, it was just Alzheimer's. Everything was Alzheimer's. This was in the 80s. And when I met Bruce and we decided to work on the book together, he explained to me that the real diagnosis was early onset Alzheimer's with the logopenic variant. And that was so important to me because the convergence of me being in graduate school, studying language, accumulating words, becoming an expert in reading happened at the same time that my father was losing language. That terrible synchronicity was something that I knew I needed to work out in some way. And that is part of why I wanted to write the book, to come to terms with my grief process, which was very complicated as grief is. And one of the things I learned in reading Helen Macdonald's H is for Hawk, among many other books about grief, many other memoirs, is that there's no such thing as normal grief. So when I say it took 30 years to get over my father being sick, I don't think that that's necessarily so weird. I used to think maybe it was, but after sharing this book with people, it seems to resonate the difficulty of grief, period. And with dementia, I think each experience of grief is individual and specific. For me, the challenge of watching my father lose so much of his identity was the length of time that it took, about 12 years or so. Writing this book with Bruce was something I needed to do for me. And then I realized as I started sharing it with other people was something that might actually help other people with their own experience of a loved one who was dealing with dementia.
Wow, and I'm so glad you wrote the book, Cindy, because I really enjoyed reading it. For listeners who aren't familiar with it, I'll just give you the title of it again. It's called Finding the Right Words, a story of literature, grief and the brain, written by Cindy Weinstein and Dr. Bruce Miller. And there was a number of things I loved about it. What I really loved was the beginning of it. Cindy, you're a professor in English, and the first chapter is very much an English chapter about English, and there's lots of analogies there about books that you've enjoyed and read, and you recall a lot of those and your love of literature chapter when your dad was diagnosed, first of all, or when he started to show signs of being sick, that you were learning so much about English at the time. I think you're doing a PhD. And then the second chapter is Bruce Miller, and he describes, as you describe what's happening with your dad, Bruce is describing what has actually happened in your dad's brain. And then it goes back to the third chapter and it's about you again and the English of it. And then there's the science of it. And then over time, halfway through the book, it's you as the person who is so practiced in English become the scientist, and Bruce is the scientist becomes the professor in English, and your voices merge into one. So by the end of the book, it's like the same person has written it all the way along. It was just you were hearing different voices. And I loved that. And it was kind of halfway through I thought, wow, Bruce is starting to sound like Cindy and Cindy's starting to sound like Bruce. This is mad. And I really enjoyed that. And I wasn't expecting it. I don't know why, but I was not expecting that. So it was a really lovely way. And as you were describing things that happen, and I'm going to ask you about a little bit about the golf club. Tell me a bit about your dad's friends in the golf club, because you describe a situation that happened, and then the following chapter, Bruce describes what actually happened as a scientist. Maybe you'd share with our listeners that little vignette.
Sure thing. And I should also say that when I became a fellow at GBHI, I had written a couple of chapters of the book, and I had a lot of openness to adding things based on Bruce's tremendous experience as a neurologist. And there were chapters that I had no idea I was going to write. I would tell Bruce a story, a little anecdote that I remembered, and Bruce was like, okay, that's a chapter. And that became the reason for the diagnosis being the first chapter and a chapter on behavior. So when you talk about Bruce and my voice harmonizing at a certain point, I am so happy about that. I think that's a sign of just sort of the power of interdisciplinarity, and also the power of the friendship that Bruce and I developed over the course of writing the book, and the trust we had in each other. And also the idea that I'm writing like a scientist makes my heart sing. But back to the golf story, I was telling Bruce about my father's love of golf in Florida, where he had retired, basically imagining that his retirement would be one endless round of golf after another. He started having a lot of difficulty golfing, and the story that my mother told was that my father aimed the golf club in the wrong direction. And after that, the invitations from my father to play golf dried up. And my mother asked one of my father's quote unquote friends, why aren't you playing golf anymore? And the friend said, well, we are. And my mom said, well, why isn't Jerry part of it? Then this friend explained that they couldn't play with my dad. It was too hard for them. I think they thought dementia was contagious. They were not sort of your standard caregiver population. No one knew very much about Alzheimer's in the 80s. When I write about that story in the book, I remember my fury that my father was ostracized in that way. But I also now understand what my mom and dad were experiencing was the stigma attached to dementia and how devastating that is. And then Bruce writes about that moment and talks about sort of the spatial coordinates in the brain get attacked by dementia. It started out for my father in sort of the language centers, the network in the brain, and then metastasized, as it were, into other parts of the brain. And what I love about Bruce's reading of that anecdote, he talks about my dad's friends as the losers, because it was such an opportunity for them to display empathy and to get in touch with more vulnerable aspects of themselves. And they just refused to do that. And it was their loss, which I think is really true.
It totally was their loss. And as you wrote that chapter, I felt that you were so protective of your dad and so defensive of him. And it was almost that your dad became almost childlike. It reminded me of if my child had come home from the playground and all the kids were going to a party and my child wasn't invited. Well, it's their loss, because they, that the other kids didn't quite understand understand how to deal with my kid, but by your writing that chapter and remembering that story, it does two things. One, it displays to us, if you already get dementia and you get Alzheimer's and you understand what it's like to work with somebody who has memory loss or who has problem with cognition, or I know it's not all about memory. If you have Lewy body disease, it's not totally about memory, but that you can learn from somebody saying, why is it that you had that club in the wrong, why are you facing the wrong direction? That's very interesting.
Right.
I can just turn you around and we can go this way. That was very interesting that happened. That you have a conversation about it and remove some of the stigma instead of ignoring that it happened. Of course it happened, but to have a conversation about it. And I think we perhaps maybe in Ireland we're a little further along. I think maybe people are a little bit more educated and would include that person with dementia in the conversation. I would hope that. But we're going to have two other guests joining us very shortly from Argentina and from Ecuador. And it'll be interesting to get a sense from them what it's like, how developed those conversations are in their two countries and not from the standpoint of from Ireland or from the USA. So Cindy, this brand new series is about global equity. So the focus as an Atlantic Institute Fellow, maybe you'd explain as well, Cindy, for our listeners, the Global Brain Health Institute is just one of 7 programs in the Atlantic Institute. So that was the fellowship that you did, but there are 7 different fellowships and it's work done by Global Fellows in 5 continents. So as a Senior Atlantic Fellow, maybe you could explain to our listeners, global equity is one of the things, kind of like a buzzword all the way through the year. What does global equity mean to you?
Global equity means many things to me. It means information about dementia needs to get everywhere. It needs to get into every country, into every language. And that was one of the most powerful things for me about being a fellow in GBHI, was working with people. As an English professor, this was a skill I was able to deploy in helping people for whom English wasn't their first language and working with them on publications that they were trying to get out into the world. So disseminating information in a way that is generalizable. So everything from sharing data about importance of sleep, the importance of exercise, the ways in which depression can be a sign of dementia and not just a response to it. I think global equity is a big word, but I see it as a kind of micro process of getting into the interstices of spaces within countries, whether that's in hospitals throughout the world and making emergency room spaces better for people with dementia, getting into the labs where neurology is happening, public policy, dance studios, museums. I think that there's such an enormous range of ways in which global equity can be mobilized at the micro level to really make a difference. And I see the senior fellows doing that. There was recently a senior fellow working in Brazil with a sports museum, having people who played, well, they call it football, we call it soccer, come to the museum and remember the moments of being on the field or cheering on their favorite players and accessing parts of the brain that aren't necessarily language oriented, but muscle memory. Such a hard question, Karen, but I think the way I think about it is what specific spaces can interventions happen within countries around the world. And once you can get into those places, you can actually make a difference.
Wow, brilliant answers, Cindy. Thank you so much. What are the key messages about brain health you'd like to share with our listeners this evening? In particular, how do you deliver those messages through literature?
I learned a lot about the importance of cognitive reserve. One of the things that can be helpful in delaying some of the more difficult clinical presentations is if you have a capacious cognitive reserve. If you can't think of one word, maybe there are 5 more in your brain dictionary that you can access. So read. And as a literature professor, that's kind of a no-brainer, right? So read as much as you can. That will build up the circuitry in your brain. But then more specific to literature is the ways in which I think literature models empathy. fictional characters can get you to a place that you don't know, and you learn about it in your imagination. So for me, being on a whale ship in the 1850s, like, I can empathize with all of those sailors on the Pequod. I can even empathize with Ahab. Being able to have empathy, I think, is one of the things that literature teaches us. And so it's a combination of this scientific thing about cognitive reserve and then this more emotional thing about empathy.
Wow, wonderful. I'm so glad you mentioned Ahab, because he's almost like the third character in your book as well. My mother had Alzheimer's disease. That's my interest in dementia. And she was a great reader all her life. But as her condition deteriorated, she was no longer able to hold the whole plot of a story. She'd always been interested in poetry, but poetry became a huge part of her life because she remembered whole poems by rote. That was rote learning back in the day when she was in school. But she loved poetry, and maybe because they were short and she could hold her attention span. And even when she could no longer speak, she still loved the cadence and the rhythm. We used to just spend hours just reading poetry to her, and her hands would move like a conductor. She would conduct each poem, and it was absolutely gorgeous.
Oh, that's lovely.
It was such a lovely memory. So I love poetry. I love hearing new poems as well. So I asked you to pick a poem. Which poem did you choose? Maybe you could recite one for our listeners this evening.
Sure. I picked a poem by Emily Dickinson. It's called After Great Pain, a Formal Feeling Comes. After great pain, a formal feeling comes. The nerves sit ceremonious like tombs. The stiff heart questions, was it he that bore? And yesterday or centuries before? The feet mechanical go round a wooden way of ground or air or aught, regardless grown, a court's contentment like a stone. This is the hour of lead, remembered if outlived, as freezing persons recollect the snow, first chill, then stupor, then the letting go.
Wow.
I think it's a beautiful poem about grief. And that first line, after great pain, a formal feeling comes. I love the word formal. And this is me really projecting my own experience into the poem, so I'll concede that. But for me, after 30 years of great pain, the formal feeling, the form that my feelings took was a book that I wrote with Bruce. I think that for that reason, I chose this poem. And I also love the last line about the letting go, first chill, then stupor, then the letting go. I'm a little less confident about the letting go portion of the poem. I'm not sure one ever fully lets go of grief. In fact, I'm pretty sure you don't. But I think Dickinson really did a magnificent job describing the experience of pain and grief and trying to make sense of it through form.
Thank you so much. That was After Great Pain, a Formal Feeling Comes by Emily Dickinson, which was read for us this evening by Cindy Weinstein. And now it's time for some more music. Our next song is Typewriter 2 by Panzer Ballet, and this is the choice of our next guest, Dr. Adolfo Garcia. That was Typewriter 2 by Panzer Ballet from the album Breaking Brain, which was released in 2015 and is the music choice of our next guest, Adolfo Garcia, who joins us all the way from Argentina. Adolfo, you're very welcome to Atlantic Pacific and beyond. Thanks for joining us.
On the contrary, Karen, so happy to be here. Thanks a lot for the invitation.
Oh, delighted to have you. I haven't heard that one before, Adolfo. I can't say I'm a total fan, but tell us, it's your choice. Why did you pick that song?
It's a shocker that you haven't heard it before, really.
Seriously.
This is a song by Panzer Ballet. This is a German band that I'm just tremendously fond of. I guess there are two main things about this song, and I guess the same thing I could say about the whole of Panzer Ballet's discography that really draw me to it. It's the combination of two passions of mine, which are patterns and fuzziness. If you think about the main riff, it may sort of throw you off guard, but there's a clear mathematical pattern there, which is 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1. And it's all playing against a 4-beat rhythm. And that creates all sorts of displacements in the rhythmic structure, a polyrhythm. That's just something that I've always been fascinated by, how different structures may come together, and it's up to you to discern what they are. And the second thing is the fuzziness. If you listen to this song from beginning to end, I could propose a very unsettling question, which is, what genre is it? And you may recognize elements of jazz in it. You may recognize elements of fusion. You may recognize elements of metal. But is it any of those things? Is it none of those things? Is it some hybrid space in the interstices of those things? And that feature, how hard it is to locate something in the allegedly clear-cut categories with which we navigate the world. It's something that I really, really like. These are things that I'm also interested in as a researcher, finding patterns, trying to see what the structure is behind things that may be a little bit chaotic at first sight, and also working with those hybrid spaces, the interface of disciplines and problems and phenomena that would naturally fall, or classically, I should say, fall within the purview of specific disciplines. But of course, all of these are just rationalizations. What really moves me with these songs is just there's something that really cannot be explained. It's what this music does to your body, to your nerves, to your heart, to your brain. And we come up with all of these explanations, but I really do believe that language is a very poor vehicle to clearly convey what music does to us. So I think I would be in a better position to communicate what this means to me if I had a guitar with me, or if we had a way to communicate musically in the absence of words. So this is my poor attempt of verbalizing what this means to me, Karen.
Wow, that was some explanation, Adolfo. Can I give you my honest reaction to the song when I heard it, first of all? I was back in 1977 and I was in first year in Manor House School in Raheny, and we were learning typewriting on typewriters. And it was ASDF ;LKJ hit return carriage. And it was that same beat. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, return. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. And that was exactly the beat. And I could see the people in my class, because my name is Karen, which it kind of has a different meaning now, because my kids say things like, oh, you're going the full Karen on it. Which but there were 4 Karens in my class. And in this typewriting class, they were, Karen, stay in rhythm, and we'd all look up and we all thought we were going wrong. We were the nom de jour of 1965, apparently. So Adolfo, you gave us a wonderful explanation to that piece of music. So I'm going to give an explanation to our listeners about a little bit of background about you. You work at the interface of language, science and cognitive neuroscience. You're the director of the Cognitive Neuroscience Center in San Andreas, Argentina, and you're Senior Atlantic Fellow at the Global Brain Health Institute in the University of California, San Francisco. You now lead research research projects in over 10 countries across the globe. You have almost 200 publications, including books, chapters and papers in leading journals. You're no stranger to broadcasting. You're the host of a TV show of Brains and Words and of a radio column titled Mind and Communication. Like Cindy, your work is all about words and communication. So over the last couple of years, Adolfo, how has your work changed, having to go online through TV and radio and all the journals that you produced? How has your work changed?
Yes, it changed. It's going to be harder to answer this question than the one about what draws me to Panzer Ballet. So some aspects of the work did not change so much. I mean, the endless hours at the computer working on data, on writing, that didn't really change much. What perhaps changed was the feeling that there was no break from it. So throw in a little bit of a pandemic lockdown, a little bit of compulsion on my end, and it's a perfect recipe for a semi-short-lived disaster, I should say. I thought that I was a hardcore loner, and I realized that missing out on the possibility of those little social breaks that I did have, even in my most workaholic of times, really made all the difference. Other than that, I think that we all learned it is also possible to conduct highly international, tremendously multicentric science. The fact that we were faced with the necessity of doing this, I think it helped to break a lot of boundaries and preconceptions that we had about what education can be like and what science can be like. So I think there's that also positive side of it. From a communicative stance, I do have to recognize, however, that I think that we are losing much more than what we are gaining.
Agree.
Yes, you can see the other person's face on Zoom and you can listen to the other person, but there's so much in communication that happens just by being in the same room and by really being in a position where you can actually see the whole of the other person's body and all these little things. I think that when we are talking, we tend to overestimate how much we are doing through language. And I think that language is just one little component of communication. For some aspects, not the most critical one, I should say. And that's the one thing I miss the most.
You know, also as Cindy, our last guest, when she was talking about her dad, Jerry, and we all get emotional, particularly when there's a piece of music or a song or a poem that makes you feel very emotional. What you really want to do is be in that room with somebody and give them a hug and say, you know, gosh, that was really hard. And especially when we talk about brain health, and a lot of us are involved with dementia care, then we just go from one Zoom to the next Zoom, which is completely about something different, health economics or whatever. And you're kind of going, wow, where was the hug that I needed? It's a very kind of cruel way and a crude way of getting the message across. But I suppose it's the best we have at the moment. So, until the day that we can actually meet in person, it is what it is. So, Adolfo, this series is called Atlantic, Pacific and Beyond, and the aim is to learn more about work being done globally to raise awareness of equity, not just in brain health, but in economic, racial, social and health equity. Adolfo, if you had an opportunity to just change two things to make it a fairer place for everybody in the pandemic era, the post-pandemic era, depending on where you are in the world, what two things would you choose?
The things that I would choose to change are the ones that I could actually do something about, which may not be the most central or vital ones. But basically, I specialize in language. So I would think about a couple of things related to language. One thing that I would do is to raise awareness of how tremendously biased our coverage of language in scientific terms is around the world. There are over 7,000 languages, give or take, living nowadays in the world. And less than 0.5% of them have received any systematic attention in the scientific literature, let alone in the study of disorders of language. And within that very, very small portion of languages that have actually received any attention, the vast majority of the work comes, as you might expect, from English. So this really creates a scenario of inequity in the sense that we know very little about so many languages. And it would be a mistake to believe that whatever you learn about the relationship between the brain and language through the lenses of English is directly applicable to the remaining 7,000 odd languages out there, because languages are so different in their structure, in the way in which they resort to different resources, such as intonation and rhythm and specific configurations of words to convey the things that they try to convey. So I think that raising awareness of this source of inequity is one thing that I would like to do, and that we as a community are actively trying to do. And then the second one is more proactively, perhaps, is to start doing something about it. So raising awareness, yes, but we also have to design platforms, structures, networks that will enable us to systematically engage researchers from different world regions, share whatever experience we have, and try to start collecting data and analyzing data and producing results that are specific to those languages so that we can learn what is specific about each language in its connection to the brain and the dysfunctions of the brain, and also which patterns may be generalizable across languages. And I think that these are two missions that we are actively trying to work on, and that would be our little 2 cents, our little contribution to fostering global equity in brain health.
Wow. Thanks, Adolfo, for that. And I also asked you to pick a poem. Did you get a chance to pick one? And maybe you would, before you recite us, would you tell us why you made your choice?
Yes, absolutely. I chose a poem by A.S.J. Tessiman, and it's called Music. Before I entered academia, I was on my way to becoming a professional musician. And that's the one thing that to this day makes me tick. And there's something about music, and I think I may have hinted at it in my rationalization of that previous piece of music, that I think Tessiman captures much better here. So this is Music by A.S.J. Tessiman. This shape without space, this pattern without stuff, this stream without dimension surrounds us, flows through us, but leaves no mark. This message without meaning, these tears without eyes, this laughter without lips, speaks to us, but does not disclose its clue. These waves without sea surge over us, smooth us. These hands without fingers, close hold us, caress us. These wings without birds, strong lift us, would carry us, if only the one thread broke.
That's one of my favourite parts of this show, is getting new poets and new poems into my armoury. I had never heard of that poet. Tessimone, what nationality?
Oh, he was born in Chelsea, London, and he had an interesting life, if you will indulge my euphemism. At one point, he inherited a fortune, which he squandered in less than decorous occupations, let's say. Another part of it, he spent in psychoanalysis. He was a troubled individual. At one point, he actually underwent electric shock therapy, and that had a deleterious effect on his memory, and it probably affected his output as an artist as well. And he died shortly after turning 60 due to a brain hemorrhage. But this poem, it captures so much in such little space, doesn't it?
Oh, it's beautiful. And was he a musician as well?
Not that I know. Don't take me on that. I do not know. But this insight about music, it also makes me think about this phrase by Chesterton. All artistic expressions aspire to be music because music is pure form. And I think that's part of what is being alluded to here. You know, I said that it was hard for me to convey what that piece of music that we listened to meant to me because I was trying to do it through words. I think that that's something about music. Just like you can say, okay, so the word cup refers to this object in reality, or the word anguish refers to this feeling that I sometimes have. It's very hard for you to really pinpoint, okay, this note or this melody or this sequence of chords, you know, point systematically and objectively to this object or this feeling. But still, those combinations of form, they can move us in so many directions. It's very, very interesting to see that why that happens and how that happens is something that is very, very difficult to capture through the means of other communicative systems that we have. It is a shape without space, a pattern without stuff, and a string without dimension. Oh my, those three lines right there, I think that they just got it right.
Wow. And you have teed us up perfectly for our next piece of music, Adolfo. And our next song has been chosen by Dr. Curi Tichuana, and it's Movimiento Indígena, and this is from Ecuador.
Sí, salgamos de la crisis. quieres que los sueños se hagan realidad, despierta y únete a la solución.
Siembra, canta, ¿dónde estás? Movimiento indígena por la dignidad.
El pueblo que lucha contra la corrupción, cuido el patrimonio que me ha dejado el sol. Si no nos escuchan, porque tenemos razón, se paraliza el país. Y nos vamos todos juntos. Que los niños sonrían. Siempre son los mismos dirigiendo el país. Un cambio de aires florecerá el jardín. Si quieres que los sueños se hagan realidad, despierta y únete a la solución.
Siembra, canta, ¿dónde estás? Movimiento indígena por la dignidad.
That was Movimiento Indígena, which was taken from the album La Voz de la Tierra, which was released in 2011. And that was the song choice of our next guest, Dr. Kuri Tituania, who joins us all the way from Ecuador. Kuri, you're very welcome to Atlantic, Pacific and beyond. How are you?
Hi, Karen.
Hi,
Hi,
Kuri.
everyone. Thank you for the invitation.
I loved that song. Thank you so much. I had never heard it before. Tell us, why did you choose that song for our listeners this evening?
Okay, I think it's a positive and funny song, but I guess I should tell you something of the history of Ecuador. Okay, after colonization, we suffer a big murder of indigenous people here, a lot of inequalities in our history. But this is a music, I guess, is in honor after a big march in the 90s for the struggle for the basic rights of the indigenous people. So I guess in summary, it's invitation. It's a positive invitation to fight for our own right, not just complaining about history, its consequences, and current inequalities. So it's an invitation. You can dance it with this invitation, and that's the main message for indigenous population: fight and look for our own rights.
I love it. Thank you, Kuri. And just to give our listeners a little more background about you, you are a geriatric physician and a gerontologist. You're also an Indigenous person from Ecuador. You received your medical school training in Cuba and your speciality is in geriatrics and gerontology. You received that in Ecuador. You're interested in developing programs that serve older people living with dementia, especially Indigenous people in poverty conditions. You're a Senior Atlantic Fellow at the Global Brain Health Institute, and your vision is to improve the health of disadvantaged older people in your community. You were born in Cuba, but you've lived most of your life in Cotacachi, the small town of your grandparents. You know, I have never heard of Cotacachi until I met you, Kuri. Maybe you can describe what village life or town life was like in Cotacachi and what it was like for you growing up as an Indigenous person in Ecuador.
Yeah, okay. I'm from Cuba. I live in Ecuador, is in South America, and I live in the north of the country. So it's a small country with a lot of diversity in terms of people and in landscape and food, etc. Here in the past 30 years, being indigenous was a disadvantage. You don't have basic rights. So what's hard more for my grandparents and my parents? I guess my life it's easier because my parents could study. My mother is a physician too. My father is an economist, and they fight since they were young for the basic rights for education. So now the life is easier for me, but it doesn't mean the inequalities doesn't exist here because I live in the urban area, but I guess just 10 or 15 minutes walking from here, you can find a different situations. People poor or extremely poor. And it means that after all of these years, with all of this right, the situation doesn't change a lot. And so we need to keep fighting.
Okay. So your mom is a physician. She trained also in Cuba and you followed in her footsteps. And you were telling me a little while ago that you've described that one of the biggest problems in Ecuador is the underdiagnosis of dementia and that up to 40% of the rural population of women have cognitive impairment. Corey, that's very high for, I think that's very high, 40%. Maybe you'd explain why is that number so high in Ecuador for women?
Yeah, I have many reasons to explain that. We got the low education here, especially in women. It's high. It's still high. You can find people in their 80s that they don't know how to write or read. The desnutrition too in the rural areas. The low opportunity to study. And the percentage that you mentioned was just from one study here in Ecuador in 2010. With the concepts at that time, of course, and with, I guess it was a brief battery assessment in Spanish, and they apply to people that even if don't speak Spanish or even they don't know how to write and read. And so it's a methodology problem too, but of course I can ignore the fact that the low education of here it's a problem in Ecuador. So that's the reason that I guess we have to improve our education system, but also we have to improve our batteries to diagnose dementia.
And isn't it interesting, just going back to what Adolfo was saying about equity, if I don't know if those tests in that study that you mentioned, if those tests were done in Spanish, if that isn't their native language, the indigenous people, how are they going to score well if they're being asked those questions in Spanish? Like, I couldn't score well in a memory test in Spanish. I don't speak Spanish. So is that one of the problems that happens in Cotacachi?
Yeah, the official language here is Spanish, but there are different language too. And for example, in rural areas, people used to speak more Quechua, that different language than Spanish. And so for this, when you go to the school and you don't understand all the words in Spanish, so it's a problem to learn too. There are a lot of people who speak more Spanish than Quechua. Actually, Quechua, it's getting lost, I guess. We're getting lost Quechua here in Ecuador. For example, my grandfather had Alzheimer's. He used to speak Spanish and Quechua. But in the last few days, they start just to speak in Quechua and not in Spanish. So that's, even if you can learn another language, you have to consider all of these little things, what's going to happen the end of life. If you don't speak Quechua, how I am going to communicate with that person? So you have to consider all of these things. Even if you are a child, you have difficulties in school. After that, you learn to speak Spanish. But if you develop some brain disorder or brain problem.
Wow, very interesting, Corey. You've just reminded me of a friend of mine whose mother was a native Irish speaker. So Irish is a language that we speak in Ireland. Well, it's actually not one we speak, it's one we learn in school. But this woman I'm thinking about, she was a native speaker who learned English in school and she got dementia and she reverted back to her native language, to Irish. And in the nursing home where she was, nobody spoke Irish. So she found it very isolating. She didn't remember any of the English that she was taught in school, even though she had spoken English all her life. And her children didn't understand Irish because they'd only had school Irish that they learned. They all took back to learning Irish again just to communicate with their mother. So what you've told me about your grandfather is just a reflective of that. Very interesting. Corey, I asked you as well to find a poem or a reading that you would share with our listeners. What one did you find?
Okay. I choose a paragraph from a book for Boulder, Making the Most of Our Longer Lives. The author is Carl Honore. You know, I'm a geriatric physician, so when I have the opportunity to talk about aging, so I do. And the paragraph says, how can we renew the image of aging? By sharing the visual landscape more equitable among the different generations, representing the third age with all its nuances, richness, and diversity, focusing attention on those people who are making the most of the longevity revolution and redefining what it's meant to be older. The good news is that it's already happening all over the world.
Wow. Thank you so much. That was a passage from Boulder, Making the Most of Our Longer Lives by Carl Honore, read for us this evening by Dr. Kuri Titanywa. And now I'd like to reintroduce Cindy Weinstein. Cindy, you've listened to Adolfo and Kuri share their stories. What would you like to say about global equity before we say goodbye to our listeners this evening? And perhaps maybe you would tell us, where can we get your book?
Well, first off, magnificent discussion. Thank you so much, Adolfo and Curry. I feel like I learned so much in an hour. It was just like being back at UCSF at the grand rounds. So thank you so much for that. I think my takeaway here is that language is both an entry point and an obstacle. I was really taken by Adolfo's comment that there are 7,000 languages in the world and we study less than 1%. What a problem that is. And then hearing about Kuri and her grandfather being able to speak both Spanish and Quichua, and then in his last days, leaving Spanish by the wayside, and the importance of, from an equity point of view, studying the multiplicity of languages in order to create global equity and how important that is. And yet, I think the fact that Karen asks us to present music and poetry speaks to the ways in which language is also an obstacle, and that there are so many other parts of the brain that we're just beginning to learn about, help form us as full people, the ways in which music plays such an important role in that regard. And for me, as someone who has been obsessively focused on words for so long, the liberating aspects of these new ways of thinking about cognition and the brain through muscle memory and music is just so important. I'm just so grateful to have heard all about that. And that's my takeaway, Karen.
Thanks so much, Cindy. And I bought your book on Amazon, so for our listeners, they can get that on Amazon. Is to bring Adolfo back into the conversation again. Adolfo, just something that Cindy said there about the choices of music and poetry. I always ask guests to choose a poem and a piece of music to share with our listeners, and it sounds like an easy thing to do, but it's actually quite hard, isn't it? And especially when I say choose your favourite. I mean, it's that word favourite really stumbles a lot of people. Do you think maybe there's room to include a conversation around sharing our literary and music passions with the rest of the global community as a way to communicate different messages by using different parts of the brain, as Cindy said? What do you think, Adolfo?
Well, yes, in spirit, but then you think about how to turn that into concrete reality, and that's where things are going to get challenging. There are aspects of poetry that have historically acted as sort of boosts or supports for memory. Rhyme itself, repetition. These are things that troubadours and bards have relied on, basically even before there was literature per se. I mean, and in the absence of a written page where you could have a testimony, long-lasting record of a text, you only had your memory to rely on. So there were all these little tricks that people relied on to make sure that that information would last longer. And I think that there's something to be learned just from that very basic memory trick that early poets used to rely on. You know, going back to what we were saying, those things that are very, very hard to really capture and convey through words. And I think that similar things could be said about music. It is known, for instance, that musical memory is remarkably preserved. Even advanced cases of Alzheimer's disease, even when other memory systems like episodic memory or semantic memory, there are aspects of musical memory that seem to be quite resilient.
Perfect. Thanks so much for that, Adolfo. And Curry, I have never been to Ecuador, but in advance of this programme this evening, I was having a look online and it looks amazing. So would you please give us 3 good reasons? I mean, I don't need 3 good reasons, I just need to look at it, but 3 good reasons why we should visit Ecuador.
Right, Karen. As every country, Ecuador is beautiful too. It's not exception. It's a small country where you can find a huge diversity in food, especially strange food and delicious food, landscape. And the main reason, I guess, if everybody's going to love it, it's really cheap.
Okay.
Ecuador is cheap, and we use the American dollar is our current, our official currency as the same dollar in America. So it's going to be easy to manage the money, and it's cheap.
Okay, Curry, you have me sold. And on that note, I'd like to say a huge thank you to my guests, Cindy Weinstein, Adolfo Garcia and Curry Tatonia. And thanks so much for joining us here on Near FM in Dublin and LLARC in the UK for this very special programme about global equity. Curry, I think you'll like this one. It's Ecuador by Sash. And thanks for listening.
Dame tu mano y venga conmigo. Vámonos al viaje para buscar los sonidos mágicos de Ecuador.